Hi, I'm Jess, and I'm a late discovered autistic ADHDer with a passion for educating other neurodivergent adults so they can understand their brains and build lives that work for them. Autism is a wildly misunderstood condition that affects virtually every area of an autistic person's life. I could probably spend hours and days sharing all of the information about autism that there is to know. But since this is only one video, I'm going to give as basic a rundown as I can. I'm using the diagnostic criteria from the DSM translated into slightly less deficit-based terms. This way, if you're someone who is considering a professional diagnosis, you'll be able to talk about your traits in a way that matches the criteria that your assessor will be using. It's also important to note that it's called autism spectrum disorder because each trait exists on a spectrum. It's not a reference to whether someone is a little bit autistic or severely autistic. I'm going to be using a lot of my own personal experiences to help explain things here, but these traits look different in everyone. You might even feel the complete opposite to what I describe, and that's the spectrum, baby. Finally, when I use the word diagnosis, I am referring to both official and self-diagnosis. I am self-diagnosed autistic by choice, but there are a lot of barriers to getting an official diagnosis as an adult. That'll be a topic for another video. Let's get into it. There are 4 criteria for autistic traits in the DSM that indicate a diagnosis. Those criteria are persistent differences in social communication and interaction with others, repetitive or monotropic patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. Your traits must have existed since early childhood, and your traits must be severe enough to impact your life. Specifically, they will impact your ability to thrive. I'll give a description of each criteria, and then I'll give personal examples of how those traits show up for me. Because autism is usually talked about in such deficit-based language, I find that hearing about what it actually looks like in an autistic person gives a much more holistic picture. So the first criteria of autism is differences in social communication and interaction. There are 3 traits under this criteria. For a diagnosis, you need to have all 3 of these traits. The first trait is differences in social emotional reciprocity. These are things like different social approaches, having a preference for discourse over dialogue, which means one-sided conversations as opposed to more of a back and forth, a reduced or heightened sharing of interests, and a reduced or heightened emotional response to situations. We also tend not to initiate many social interactions and have some differences when it comes to social imitation. Here's what that looks like in real life, taken from my own experiences as an autistic adult. When I want to start a conversation, I would much rather just start talking about the topic at hand rather than first saying hello and making small talk before diving into the real nitty-gritty. My conversations also tend to be more one-sided rather than having a traditional back and forth where one person shares a little, the other person shares a little back, and so forth. I prefer to share all of the information I want to say with the other person, and then they share all of their pertinent information. I do not like it when other people touch my stuff, ever, not even my partner. Sorry, my love. This goes into the reduced sharing of interests. I also had to teach myself to remember to do things like smile back at people when they smile at me, and I had to train my face so that my smile looked normal. That one falls under the social reciprocity area of it. The second trait is about nonverbal communication differences. Things like not making eye contact, difficulties understanding and using body language and gestures, unusual volume, tone, rhythm in speech, and flat affect. The eye contact thing threw me for a loop when I was first discovering my autism until I realized that I don't actually look into people's eyes when I'm talking to them. I remember my dad teaching me when I was a kid to look right here when I'm talking to people, so it looks like I'm making eye contact. I can also identify people a lot easier by their eyebrows, nose, or mouth than I can by their eyes, or eye color especially. My body language is not automatic all the time either. I have to intentionally remember to do things like keep a smile on my face and make sure to keep my arms uncrossed, which apparently means that you don't like talking to the person. If I don't pay attention to my speech, I'll often have others tell me that I'm mumbling, talking too quietly, or too fast. And unless I'm talking about something I find super interesting, my affect is flat. In my head, I feel like my speech has a lot of cadence and intonation, but when I watch my videos back, I'll be like, dang, I really am pretty monotone, huh? But on the flip side, if I am talking about something exciting, my facial expressions become very exaggerated and over the top. The third and final trait of this category is differences in developing and maintaining relationships. These are things like not adjusting your behavior in response to others' social cues, not engaging in extensive imaginary play with peers as a child, and challenges making and keeping friends, and also a general lack of interest in other people. Most of what I know about social cues, I had to be directly taught, either by myself or by someone else. I also have a tendency to insert myself into conversations, especially at work, that I'm not necessarily welcome in because I don't pick up on whatever context indicates that I'm not invited to that conversation. Growing up, I was bullied a lot more than I realized too. I mostly learned it was bullying through telling these funny stories to my friends as an adult and having them point out that I was in fact being made fun of. So that's fun. My pretend play was pretty basic too, and I actually preferred to dress my Barbies and rearrange their houses for maximum Barbie efficiency than I did playing with them in the traditional sense. The next criteria is monotropic and or repetitive patterns of behavior. There are 4 traits under this criteria, and you must have at least 2 out of the 4 for a diagnosis. The first trait is repetitive speech, movements, or use of objects. These are things like pedantic or overly formal speech, echolalia, stimming, picking, and lining up objects. Growing up, I always got comments on how smart and well-spoken I was, and a lot of times I would be accused of being a smart aleck, whatever that means. Much of my echolalia shows up as TV and movie quotes. A big one for me in middle school was whatever I feel like I want to do, gosh, from the classic cult film Napoleon Dynamite. I didn't do much flapping or rocking until recently. Apparently, I learned to suppress that early on because it looked weird and made others uncomfortable. But now, when I'm overwhelmed or overstimulated, and if I remember, I will flap my hands or rock, and it helps me regulate a lot. I was pretty big into nail biting when I was younger, and I'll also pick the skin on my lips and the inside of my mouth as a stim nowadays. Something that I always got called out on a lot is my hair twirling tendencies. I have always been a hair twirler, except when my hair was literally too short to do it. But I will stay like this for hours, all day, until my arm hurts, even now. I've also always lined things up, though not in the traditional or obvious sense that most people associate with autism. I would make small rearrangements to my environment, such as making sure my fork and knife were perfectly aligned with the napkin before eating, or even reaching over to my friend's desk to straighten out their notebooks. Sorry, Echo. The second trait in this criteria is adherence to routines and rituals and being overwhelmed by sudden changes. Monotropic thinking, also known as rigid thinking, is also included in this criteria. These are things like having ritualized patterns of behavior, repetitive questioning, compulsions, difficulty with transitions or changes, taking things literally, and being super serious about rules. Here are some of my examples. I always try to park my car in the same exact spot when I go places because it helps me remember where my car is, and I like having a familiar place to go. In school and even in college, I would get very attached to my seat, even if it wasn't officially assigned. And if someone else sat in my seat before I got there, I would get very, very angry. Once I learn how to do something, I will do it that way every single time. This was particularly apparent at the bakery I worked at, where I did everything exactly the way I was first trained until I saw someone doing it in a way more efficient way. And my brain would explode because doing it in a different way just straight up did not occur to me. When I'm driving somewhere, I will take the same route every single time. I'll even sometimes go out of my way to take a more familiar route to a destination. I am way more likely to rewatch a TV show or movie that I've already seen dozens of times rather than start something new. Transitions have always been hard for me as well. As a kid, I remember when I would go to my best friend's house and it was time to go home, if I knew my mom was on the way, I would hide somewhere for a game of hide and seek, knowing that this would buy me an extra few minutes before I had to leave. And no, it wasn't just because I didn't want to go home. I definitely did. I just needed time to get used to the idea. As an adult, if I have a plan for the day and one thing gets derailed, I get very dysregulated, and it takes a lot of effort for me to reconfigure the plan if I don't just give up. For example, say I have a list of errands to run and a few stores to go to. If one of the stores is unexpectedly closed when I get there, which happens a lot because I like to shop in the mornings when no one else is out, I will either have to have a very serious conversation with myself to do the rest of my errands, or I will just force quit and go home and try again the next day. I've always been a firm believer in following the rules, too. I was what you'd call a goody two-shoes in school, and I remember wishing that hall monitor was a real position. When I started working, I always had trouble understanding why my coworkers always seemed to be bending and breaking the rules, but when I would try it, I would always do it wrong and get in trouble, so I stopped. The third trait of this criteria is having interests that are particularly intense. This includes things like having a strong attachment to certain objects, having special interests, and being intensely perfectionistic. My longest running special interests include SpongeBob, cats, Harry Potter, which is now tainted, and psychology. I think the last one had the sneakiest manifestation, especially when I was younger, because I would engage in that interest by digging deep into the depths of the personal lives of whatever celebrity I was a fan of at the time. I had learned that asking personal questions of the people that you knew was considered intrusive, so I did it to famous people instead, using Tiger Beat and J14, and eventually the internet. I know so much about Aaron Carter's family and personal life. Later on, I did the same thing to Brendan Urie and Panic at the Disco as a whole, but mostly Brendan Urie. Anywho, I also get really attached to things, like really attached. In pastry school, one of my friends accidentally knocked over a Doctor Who mug I'd gotten a couple of months prior, and I literally cried in front of all of my friends. Not because I was mad at the person who broke it, but I was just so sad that it was broken. I was 20. Just a few months ago, I broke this spatula, and it was my favorite spatula, and one day it just snapped, and yes, I cried again. Notice also that it's been months, and I still haven't thrown it out. That's because I can't. Ever since I learned what perfectionist meant, I have identified as one. My status as a Virgo did not help with that. If something doesn't match what my brain is picturing as just right, it will freaking bug me. Things like typos, crooked or stray lines, or when someone is erasing a board and they leave one tiny mark on the thing. Ugh, it's all I can pay attention to until it's gone or fixed. The fourth and final trait of this criteria is having either hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input, or showing a reduced or heightened interest in certain sensory aspects of the environment. Hypersensitivity means that you are very sensitive, and hyposensitivity means that you are not so sensitive. You can be hypersensitive in some areas and hyposensitive in others. They can also change over time. Sensory input includes things like sound, smell, taste, vision, touch, and vestibular or inner ear balance type stuff. I've always been a big fan of light touches, and I'll get goosebumps all over when someone like runs their finger lightly along my arm or back or plays with my hair or something. Listening to my favorite music also gives me brain squeezes, especially with songs that have a lot of bass or fast beat. I also get goosebumps if I listen to a good song, which does not happen to everyone. This is called frisson, and it's actually really cool. I love swimming and being in water, and when I was a kid, I would swim every single day that I could. I can hear buzzing of appliances and other ambient noises all the time, even in my own house. I do not like to be sticky, and if I do touch something sticky, I have to wash my hands immediately. This was especially a pain when I worked in a coffee shop and would get flavor syrup on my hands every 3 seconds. I would have to stop and wash my hands and just like start over again. Ugh. Chewing or really any mouth sounds give me a visceral reaction of just pure loathing and disgust. I called that misophonia for a while before I realized that I was autistic. I'm also really sensitive to bright light. I wear blue light glasses indoors all the time, and I can't go outside without sunglasses during the day or the sun will hurt my eyeballs, even when it's cloudy. The third criteria simply states that you have to have these traits since early childhood, so before the age of 8 or so. If they showed up later, it's likely due to another condition, such as PTSD or other trauma-related things. The final criteria for a diagnosis is that your traits must be significant enough to impact your life. This one is very subjective, meaning that how you are affected is different for literally everyone. There are 3 things that psychology keeps in mind for diagnosis purposes: frequency, intensity, and duration. Basically, if something happens a lot and you either have to deal with it or work around it, and it has occurred for a very long time, that counts. Congratulations, you've got the neurospices. Welcome to the club.